Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicholas DiMoncho. I'm director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, and in a kind of ambient NPR voice type of way, I'm here to start to try and frame this conversation as folks trickle in and we get started here on the morning. So I promise not to tax you too much at the very outset, but rather to set up what should be a really interesting and essential day of conversations. So, as I said, I'm director of the Berkeley Center for New Media, and we are delighted to present today's symposium, Hacking Politics, in partnership with the SFMOMA's Public Knowledge Program, the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, the Berkeley Law School, and the Four Freedoms Initiative. Before I do anything else, I want to thank, in particular, everyone who made today's conversations possible. From the very beginning, I would like to thank Sonia Kaital from the Law School, Mike Magursky, who's here with us today, and Jeremy Rue from the School of Journalism, who helped me and us think about and reach out to all of the issues involved in this essential conversation, and all the participants we will have in our conversations today. Also, in particular, Laura Wolf and Laurie McPhee, our BCNM staff members who work so hard to make sure that you don't see the hard work of putting such an event together. And then to Dina Chalabi of SFMOMA, Dean Ed Wasserman of the Berkeley Journalism School, Dean Edward Cherminsky of Berkeley Law, and the Four Freedoms Initiative for being our institutional partners in today's conversation. So as I was trying to think about what to say in this, we sort of reflexively put in this introduction by me, but I'm really not introducing a conversation in which I have a particular expertise other than that of a citizen themselves. I'm not an expert in law, I'm not an expert in computing or politics, but rather an architect, which is admittedly an interesting word in this context. It seems to rhyme always with a crucial piece of informational architecture, the archive, but not, as it turns out, from any common root in the idea of building, but rather in the idea of power itself. Because just as an architect was deemed to be the master of building, the archy of the tecton of building, the archive was simply a place of power or mastery. The home of Roman officials, it became associated as a building with information through the fact of the control and storage of information by those in power. And the word politics itself comes from that over which these administrators would have power. The Greek word for city, just as the idea of civics comes from the Latin word for civitas, the fundamental unit of political and social reality. In this context, it's maybe also important to remember that, that voting and civics lie at the root of computing itself. America's decennial census is required in the Constitution to apportion districts in the House of Representatives, where it lies there alongside one of the greatest stains on that document, the 3/5 Compromise, over the counting of slaves in the apportionment of those districts. By the end of the 19th century, this decennial counting method was taking longer and longer and longer by hand counting methods. The 1870 census took up to 1878 to count, and without any other tools being used, the 1880 census was predicted to take up to 1893 to count, so long after the subsequent census had begun. And it was with precisely this problem in mind that a young MIT engineer named Herman Hollerith first interned with the Census Office and then left to start his own company, the Calculating, Tabulating, and Recording Company that proposed and invented a series of clockwork-like electromechanical mechanisms to aid specifically in the counting of individuals for census tracts and therefore for the constitutional methods of American government. You know that company better by the name it took on in 1921, the International Business Machines Corporation, or IBM. So to think deeply about civics and computing is actually not really to think about two separate phenomena, similarly to architecture and civics themselves, but rather two conditions that are inextricably intertwined from computing's own origins. But back to architecture itself for a moment, and not just in the sense it's used in today's tech economy to architect solutions at every scale, but just a building. This sense of architecture and power have also had a long and frankly largely disgraceful history together. It's not a mere coincidence that our current president developed his instinctive mastery of various forms of media through the art of building and promotion of building projects. And indeed, it's part of a small but distinct profile and courage that the architect of Trump Tower, the Paul Rudolph protege Der Scutt, refused to collude with the current president in maintaining the false information that the building had dozens more floors than it actually possesses, losing all subsequent work with the Trump organization in the process, but retaining, one hopes, some sense of his own integrity. We have built just a temporary edifice here today, not a temple but a tent. It contains multiple ideas and conversations about this fundamental fact. From our political structures and infrastructures, through our own political process, to the larger framework of civil society, we live in an era where the intersection of media, technology, and politics is producing profound and profoundly unpredictable effects. Over the course of today, we will reflect on the data-driven processes of partisan gerrymandering, on the asymmetric network effects of social media, and perhaps most essentially on the fundamental architecture of our city's civil society's great unrest, its fracturing and bifurcation into incomparable and often factually unfounded narratives, particularly, as Yochai Benkler, Robert Farris, and Hal Roberts have observed in their exhaustive Oxford University Press study of the last few years, network propaganda on one side of our political spectrum. This conversation actually began last night with a profoundly inspiring panel on the role of data in building civic solidarity with the artist Barak Arakan, data journalist Sindhuja Rangarajan, and artist and Berkeley grad Zunju of the anti-eviction mapping process with Dina Chalabi of SFMOMA's public knowledge program in their amazing space in the museum, which I encourage you all to visit. The conversation continues this morning with our first panel on political structures and infrastructures with Lawrence Norden, Deputy Director of the Brennan Center's Democracy Program, Ruth Greenwood, Senior Legal Counsel of the Campaign Legal Center, and the writer Ingrid Burrington, moderated by Sarah Dean of the California College of the Arts. This panel will attempt to unearth the challenges, both political and infrastructural, of an increasingly digital civic infrastructure. From hacking of voting machines to data-driven gerrymandering that followed, in particular, the Republican Party's Operation Red Map, all mean that the politics of information affect our own political systems at those very foundations on which it's built. After a tasty lunch in one of our neighborhood restaurants, or Yali's Cafe on the ground floor, we will move to the role of information in political campaigns themselves, joined by Nate Persili of the Stanford Law School, Maciej Seglowski of Pinboard and Tech Solidarity, and Girija Ranade from our own EECS department here at Berkeley, moderated by my colleague Ed Wasserman from the School of Journalism. We will be providing you with tea and coffee at our afternoon break, where you will hopefully rejoin us to finish with a larger gaze at the role of information in civil society itself. Joined again by the artist Barak Arakan, who's completing a multi-year residency in the Public Knowledge Program at SFMOMA, Erica Baker from Patreon, and Mackenzie Walk, professor of the New School and author, of course, of A Hacker Manifesto, moderated by Dina Chalabi of SFMOMA. All right. Extending the lens of our debate into society at large, and particularly into the intersection of art, technology, and society that the Berkeley Center for New Media makes its particular lens into the world, we'll be joined by the artist Hank Willis-Thomas for a concluding keynote at 5 p.m. And then the most essential part of the symposium, drinks and a reception outside, where we will begin to process the conversations of the day together. And it's with an eye to that discussion over drinks outside at the end of this amazing day that I would make my last and slightly subtle point to you. If the word politics has very clear origins, the word hacking, in the sense we're using it here, is a bit more obscure. It comes from an Old Norse root meaning breaking through, but the Oxford English Dictionary dates its use far later to 1975 in the context of computing, to quote, engage in writing computer programs or software purely for personal satisfaction. And then 3 years later to 1978 to modify computer software code, especially in order to provide a typically inelegant solution or workaround. And finally, in 1982, to, quote, gain unauthorized access or control over a computer system, networks, or a person's communications, typically remotely. Now, my own understanding, and I look especially to some of our more expert panelists here today to see if it's true or not, is that the appearance of this word in this context had at least some origins in the use of the word hack at MIT, in particular to denote not just workarounds and modifications, like the use of antiquated, elaborate telephone switching equipment to control the track layout of the Tech Model Railroad Club, but also the use of the word hack there to denote a particular kind of ironic prank on the institutional powers that be, as in the placing of an MIT police cruiser atop the institution's imposing dome. And I'm moved to reflect, in the context of today's conversation, and in the context of the frankly terrifying political and civil moment we find ourselves in, on the importance of a sense of humor, in a very specific sense. Many kinds of political humor are today at what we can only describe as a weary apex. But the particular nature of the MIT hack relates to the civic and political function of a particular kind of humor, of irony, if you will, in getting us through not just a challenging and essential series of conversations like we face today, but also the larger moment in which we find ourselves. It is a humor not of cynicism so much as it is of stamina, a realistic skepticism in institutions that belies and fuels the actual efforts needed to sustain that measure of devotion by which our institutions are themselves sustained, particularly in the face of the long, hard slog often needed on that road. In the bombast and dramatically contrasting worldviews represented by our current political moment, I'm often reminded of a kind of obituary that appeared in the British magazine The Economist in 1999, lamenting, I think not incorrectly, and somewhat provocatively given the recent turn in British politics, the end of irony in British political life. As The Economist observed, irony was never a natural part of the British character, in particular in the Victorian age of empire. But the grueling experiences of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, of the First and also the Second World War, cut down to a hard steel of pragmatism of which humor is often an essential part. Lamenting this change in British life, the Foreign Office's Robert Cooper observed, quote, "Provided it is tinged with humanity, irony is not such a bad thing. It suggests a certain modesty about oneself, one's values and one's aspirations, and at least irony is unlikely ever to be used to justify programs of conquest or extermination." The British, this urge to puncture grandiose visions is captured in, most essentially, in a probably apocryphal story about Sir Oliver Franks, when he was Britain's ambassador in Washington in the 1950s. A journalist at the time asked leading ambassadors and statesmen what they desired in the coming year. The Russian ambassador mentioned the liberation of colonial people and the end to imperialism. The French ambassador spoke of a new era and peace and international cooperation and the end of imperialism from that side. Sir Oliver Franks expressed a desire for a small box of crystallized fruit. I'm particularly glad that we end our day with one of the great scholars of the idea of hacking itself, Mackenzie Wark, because I hope an essential thread to today's most essential of conversations is not just the urgency, danger, and essential calls for actions around today's shifting landscape of politics and technology, and not just the physical, technological, and civil tools we need to take up and apply to that prospect, but also quietly, and perhaps ironically, the tools we need just as much to sustain our own spirits and imaginations in the task. So with that, I thank you very much for coming here today, and I wish us all the most interesting of conversations, and that they may end not without humor as well. Thanks very much.